In the ancient days of Israel, before kingdoms rose and fell like shifting dunes, there lived a man named Gehazi. He was not a simple helper or a casual assistant. He walked in the shadow of one of the most powerful prophets the nation had ever known, Elisha, the successor of Elijah, a man through whom the voice of God flowed like living water. Gehazi understood that serving a prophet meant far more than carrying cloaks or preparing lodging. It meant living on the thin line between the seen and the unseen, where heaven whispered and earth trembled in response. Every step beside Elisha demanded humility, reverence, and a heart that could withstand the weight of holy things. Gehazi's days were filled with wonders that most people would hear only in stories. He prepared rooms for the prophet, arranged gatherings, managed travelers, and accompanied his master through villages, fields, and cities where divine interventions seemed to unfold as naturally as the sunrise. He saw lives restored, curses broken, and destinies rewritten with a single word spoken in obedience. The proximity to such sacred power could have shaped a man into a vessel of purity. But closeness to the miraculous is not the same as transformation, and the seeds of a man's future are planted in the soil of his hidden thoughts. There were mornings when Gehazi would wake before the prophet, sweeping dust from the doorway, unaware that heaven itself was already moving. Elisha often heard the voice of God long before dawn, receiving instructions about kings, armies, and humble families whose cries had reached the throne of the Almighty. Gehazi would watch his master speak mysteries no human could know naturally, and even then he struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the spiritual world he was witnessing. He learned movements, duties, and routines, but the inner work of surrender was something Gehazi avoided without realizing it. For though Gehazi stood in the presence of miracles, he did not understand the heart behind them. It is possible to hold holy things with unholy hands, to see wonders without letting them cleanse you. Gehazi carried the prophet's staff, prepared the prophet's meals, and heard the prophet's prayers, yet deep inside, unexamined desires began to stir. The world around him honored Elisha, powerful men bowed before him, and wealthy travelers offered him treasures. Gehazi saw it all and wondered why a man who could command the waters and raise the dead refused to take anything for himself. Still, in those early days, Gehazi did not appear troubled. He watched the prophet perform miracles that defied logic. Waters healed with a pinch of salt, a widow's last jar of oil overflowing until dozens of vessels stood filled, and food poisoned by death made pure again with a handful of flour. To Gehazi, these were not distant events. He was often in the room, touching the vessels, gathering the bowls, standing by as divine power turned despair into hope. But a miracle that does not melt the heart can leave a man standing unchanged in the glow of glory. One of the most striking moments came when a wealthy woman from Shunem welcomed Elisha into her home. Gehazi witnessed her generosity, simple, pure, without demands or hidden intentions. She built a small upper room for the prophet, furnishing it with care so he could rest during his journeys. Elisha, moved by her kindness, used Gehazi as his messenger. The prophet promised her a child, even though her age and circumstances made such a blessing impossible. When the promise was fulfilled, Gehazi saw joy bloom in that household like a long-awaited spring. But Gehazi also saw the day tragedy struck. The child grew ill suddenly and died in his mother's arms. She rushed to find Elisha, brushing past Gehazi as though his presence could not soothe her pain. She sought the man of God directly. Elisha sent Gehazi ahead with his staff, instructing him to lay it upon the child. Alone in the boy's room, Gehazi did exactly as he was told, but nothing happened. The staff remained still, cold, unresponsive. Gehazi returned to Elisha with the news. No breath, no movement, no sign of life. What Gehazi did not grasp was that authority does not come through proximity alone. You cannot borrow someone else's relationship with God. Elisha entered the room himself, and through deep, fervent prayer, life returned to the child. Gehazi saw the impossible bend once again to a servant of the Most High, but he did not understand why the miracle had not responded to him. He held the prophet's staff, but not the prophet's heart. And in that gap, something subtle but dangerous began to take root. The miracles continued, yet Gehazi's eyes shifted. He saw the widow rescued by oil, but wondered how such abundance could be refused as payment. He saw the Shunammite woman fall to her knees in gratitude, but questioned why gifts were never accepted. The prophet moved with total purity, But Gehazi began to question whether purity alone could sustain a man in this world. His thoughts grew quiet, hidden, swelling slowly like a shadow lengthening at dusk. Serving God is not merely about following instructions, it is about surrendering the inner life. Gehazi obeyed outwardly, but his heart wandered inwardly. He did what he was told, but he no longer saw service as sacred. The routines that once humbled him now became opportunities to analyze, to compare, and eventually to desire what was forbidden. The seed of divided loyalty had been planted. Days turned into seasons, and the tension inside Gehazi deepened. Though he continued to walk beside Elisha, hold the prophet's staff and speak on the prophet's behalf, something within him grew dull to the voice of heaven. His obedience remained intact, but his reverence began to fade. And while no one around him saw the shift, the heavens saw everything. A man's downfall rarely begins with public rebellion. It begins in the quiet corners of the heart, in the whispers a man entertains when he thinks no one is listening. Before long, Gehazi would face a moment that would expose everything hidden inside him. It would come in the form of a foreign commander, a man burdened by both power and disease, who would step onto Israel's soil, seeking a miracle only the God of Elisha could provide. And in that encounter, the true state of Gehazi's heart would rise to the surface like iron pulled by a magnet. When the foreign commander arrived in Israel, Gehazi sensed the shift in the air before he even saw the man. Rumors had spread quickly. A mighty Syrian general was seeking the prophet of Israel, carrying with him not only desperation, but an entourage of soldiers, chariots, and treasures fit for a king. When the dust finally rose on the horizon, Gehazi stood beside Elisha and watched the scene unfold with a mixture of curiosity and quiet envy. Naaman descended from his chariot with the posture of a conqueror, yet the disease that clung to his skin made him appear small beneath all his armor and wealth. Gehazi was the one sent to greet Naaman at the door, for Elisha chose not to receive the commander personally. This confused Gehazi. Why refuse such honor? Why treat a powerful man with such indifference? But Elisha lived by heaven's protocol, not earthly flattery. He instructed Gehazi to deliver a simple message. The general must go to the Jordan River and immerse himself 7 times. No ceremony, no ritual, no exchange of gifts, only obedience. Gehazi watched Naaman's face contort with offense, pride pierced by a command that felt beneath him. The commander rode away in anger, his chariot wheels grinding the earth in frustration. Gehazi assumed the miracle had been squandered, but God does not yield to human pride, nor does he tailor his glory to human dignity. At the urging of his servants, Naaman humbled himself and followed the prophetic instruction. Gehazi learned later that as Naaman rose from the 7th immersion, his flesh became as pure as a child's, untouched, renewed, restored. Another miracle had been granted, and Gehazi stood again near the eruption of divine mercy. When Naaman returned to the prophet's house, Gehazi could see the transformation in the man's eyes long before he spoke a word. This was not the proud commander who had arrived earlier. This was a man touched by God. With earnest gratitude, Naaman offered Elisha silver, gold, and exquisite garments, treasures that shimmered even from afar. Gehazi felt his breath tighten. Such wealth could have secured everything he had ever dreamed of. Yet Elisha refused without hesitation. The prophet made it clear that divine healing was not a transaction and could not be purchased. Gehazi stood still, stunned by Elisha's rejection. He had served faithfully, walked miles under the sun, endured dust and hardship, and watched countless people receive blessings. But now that an opportunity for abundance stood before them, Elisha turned away. Gehazi felt something inside him shift, like a door creaking open to a dark room he had tried to ignore. He had long admired Elisha, but now he questioned him in silence. Why reject a blessing so freely offered? Why walk away from the abundance others longed to give? As Naaman prepared to leave, Gehazi's gaze followed the caravan with an intensity he could not hide. The horses adorned with ornate harnesses, servants carrying chests of silver, bundles of fine garments. Everything symbolized opportunity. Opportunity for comfort, opportunity for recognition, opportunity for a future where he was not merely the shadow of a prophet, but a man with wealth, security, and status. The desire that had once murmured quietly now spoke with boldness inside him. How could such riches simply be allowed to return unused to Syria? When the dust from Naaman's departing chariot settled, Gehazi stood in the courtyard with a whirlwind inside his chest. Elisha walked back into the house peacefully, but Gehazi's heart was anything but still. The prophet's refusal replayed in his mind like an echo that refused to fade. Gehazi tried to resume his duties as though everything were normal, yet every step felt heavy, every task felt meaningless. He could not stop thinking about the treasure drifting farther and farther away. As the afternoon faded, Gehazi's thoughts hardened into intent. He reasoned with himself, reshaping temptation into justification. Had he not served faithfully? Had he not given years of his life to the prophet? Was it so wrong to accept what Elisha had declined? After all, Naaman had insisted. The gifts were freely offered. Gehazi began to convince himself that he deserved something for his loyalty, for his sacrifices, for his continued presence beside a man who wanted nothing material for himself. Soon, Gehazi's imagination birthed a plan. He would go after Naaman discreetly, explain that Elisha had changed his mind, and accept only a portion of what the general had brought. It seemed harmless, even reasonable. No one would be harmed. Naaman would be grateful. Elisha might never know. And thus desire matured into deception. Once a seed enters the heart, the mind becomes an architect of excuses. Gehazi's feet moved before his conscience could protest. He left the prophet's house quietly, slipping through the gates with urgency pulsing in his veins. The journey to catch Naaman was not short, but Gehazi's determination fueled him. Each step felt like a break from submission, a sprint toward a future he believed he deserved. As he approached the caravan, Naaman recognized him and stopped immediately, honored that a servant of the holy prophet had pursued him. Gehazi bowed with practiced humility, concealing the truth beneath layers of calmness and calculated words. He invented a story. 2 young prophets had arrived unexpectedly, and Elisha wished to bless them with help from Naaman. It was a lie draped in piety, and Naaman believed every word. The general insisted on giving Gehazi more than requested, 2 talents of silver and multiple garments. Servants carried the heavy bags for him, placing the treasure carefully before Gehazi escorted them away. To the watching world, nothing seemed amiss, but in the unseen realm, a man had traded his calling for metal and cloth. By the time Gehazi returned home, night had begun to settle softly over Israel. He hid the treasure in a secret place, burying silver and garments like seeds he hoped would grow into a future he had long imagined. But the weight in his chest refused to rest. He washed his hands, straightened his clothes, and entered the house as though nothing had happened, forgetting that no darkness can conceal a heart from the eyes of God. When Gehazi stepped back into Elisha's presence, he carried himself with the same outward composure he had always shown. His hands were steady, his face calm, and his voice poised, but the heart beneath that calm exterior was trembling. He had convinced himself that his deception was invisible, that the quiet of the evening would hide the footsteps he had taken and the silver he had buried. Elisha, however, was a man who lived with heaven's windows open. Nothing done in the shadows remained hidden for long. Elisha looked at him with eyes that carried both gentleness and fire, the kind of gaze that could pierce through layers of sincerity and falsehood alike. The prophet asked, "Where have you been, Gehazi?" A question not seeking information but offering one final chance for truth. Gehazi felt his throat tighten, but pride pressed down on his shoulders like a hand steering him into deeper deception. "I have not gone anywhere," he answered, the lie sliding out as easily as breath. But the silence that followed was heavier than any rebuke. Elisha's voice, when it came, was calm and unwavering, as though he spoke on behalf of the Spirit himself. "Did not my spirit go with you," he said, "when the man stepped down from his chariot to meet you?" In that moment, Gehazi felt the full weight of what he had done, every step he had taken, every word he had spoken, every secret he had hidden. The prophet had seen it all, carried by divine insight that no deceit could escape. The prophet's sorrow was deeper than anger. Elisha did not mourn the silver or the garments. He mourned the heart that had turned away. "Is this the time," he asked, "for silver, for garments, for vineyards, for servants?" It was not a question about wealth, but about priorities. Gehazi had walked beside miracles, lived among sacred things, and still had not learned to discern what heaven valued. He wanted the privileges of the calling without the purity it required. Gehazi stood still, the truth tightening around him like a closing trap. He had wanted a future of comfort, recognition, and ease, but what he gained instead was exposure. The man who had once held the prophet's staff was now stripped bare before God and before the one he had served. He had hoped to hide beneath the cloak of service, but no amount of outward obedience could mask an inward corruption that had been quietly growing for years. Then came the judgment, spoken with a solemnity that shook Gehazi to the core. "The leprosy of Naaman shall cling to you," Elisha declared, "and to your descendants forever." The sentence did not fall like a striking blow. It fell like a truth revealed. Gehazi had thought he could take what was Naaman's without consequence. Now the very affliction God had removed from the foreign commander, the symbol of impurity and distance, would become Gehazi's inheritance. Almost immediately, his skin began to pale, shifting to the unmistakable white tone of leprosy. It spread like frost across his hands, arms, and face, each patch of afflicted skin mirroring the spiritual decay that had been festering inside him. Gehazi felt the horror of it, not only in his flesh, but in his soul. What had begun with a single step of desire had now unfolded into a lifetime of separation. The wealth he had craved now felt like chains. The garments he had taken now symbolized everything he had lost. Gehazi left the prophet's house not as a trusted servant, but as a man banished by his own choices. He walked into the open night, the stars glimmering above him like distant witnesses to his downfall. The paths he had once traveled with purpose now felt foreign beneath his feet. He was no longer the servant of a prophet. He had become a warning carried on the wind. The isolation was immediate and devastating. Lepers were not permitted to dwell among the people, and so Gehazi found himself exiled from everything familiar. The silence of his new life pressed heavily upon him. No footsteps behind Elisha, no sacred tasks, no whispered prayers rising through the house of the prophet. The man who had witnessed some of the greatest miracles in Israel's history now sat alone, cut off from the presence that could have shaped his destiny. He had touched the edge of divine power, but had never let it transform him. And now, with every breath, he tasted the bitterness of what he had chosen instead. But the tragedy extended beyond his own life. The prophet's sentence had included Gehazi's descendants, tying his choices to the generations that would follow. Gehazi had hoped to secure a legacy of material comfort. Instead, he left behind a legacy of suffering. His children and their children after them would bear the mark of his decision. In ancient Israel, a man's legacy was everything: his name, his line, his story. Gehazi's story was now a cautionary echo, a reminder of what happens when devotion is swallowed by desire. As the years passed, Gehazi became a symbol among the people, a living parable of misplaced priorities. His story was not one of sudden rebellion, but of quiet compromise, the kind that slips into the heart unnoticed until it reshapes the entire course of a life. He had walked beside a prophet, touched holy things, and heard heaven's voice indirectly, yet the part of him that needed transformation remained untouched. His downfall was not due to ignorance, but due to negligence of the inner life. And so Gehazi faded from the pages of Israel's history, not with a blaze of glory, but with the soft, haunting silence of potential wasted. He had been given opportunities few ever received, but he traded them for the illusion of earthly gain. His life became a mirror through which future generations could examine their own hearts. And though Gehazi's story ended in exile, it carried a message that continued to shine like a lantern in the darkness. Proximity to the sacred is not the same as purity, and a calling means nothing when the heart behind it is compromised. Gehazi's story did not vanish instantly after his exile. Rather, it lingered like a quiet echo in the minds of those who had known him. People would speak of him in hushed tones, not out of cruelty, but out of a sober awareness of how fragile the human heart can be. He had walked closer to divine power than nearly anyone in Israel, and yet his downfall began not in a great moment of temptation, but in a subtle drift, a whisper inside him that he never confronted. In a world where miracles had been common for him, he forgot that true transformation is not found in observing God's works, but in surrendering one's will. There were days when Gehazi would sit outside the boundaries of the towns, wrapped in cloth, watching flashes of life pass him by. Children played at a distance, merchants traveled the dusty roads, families gathered for evening meals, and he remained alone, forced to witness a life he no longer belonged to. As he looked at the world from afar, he could see clearly what he once had and how lightly he had treated it. He had stood in a place of privilege, one step away from a prophetic inheritance, and he traded it for silver that could not buy him even a moment of peace. In the quiet of exile, memories came to him like waves. He remembered the first time he followed Elisha, nervous but hopeful. He remembered the joy on the faces of those who received miracles, the awe that filled rooms when God acted, the warmth of the prophet's voice when speaking truth. Each memory passed like a lantern, illuminating the places where he had once walked with purpose. And with each remembered moment came the realization that he had not lost everything at once. It had slipped away gradually, as he allowed lesser desires to grow unchecked. There were moments when Gehazi wondered if repentance could undo his fate, but he knew that some consequences could not be reversed. The leprosy on his skin reminded him daily that choices carry weight, not only for oneself but often for those who follow. His descendants were now bound to a suffering he had invited through his own decisions. This truth pierced him more deeply than any physical pain. What had begun as a moment of selfishness had become a generational burden. But even in exile, Gehazi was not entirely forsaken by God. Though he bore the consequences of his actions, the breath in his lungs remained a mercy. He could still think, reflect, and learn. In those long hours alone, he began to understand something he had never grasped while serving Elisha. Reverence is not produced through proximity, but through humility. He had lived near the sacred, but he had never allowed the sacred to break him open. His hands had carried the prophet's staff, yet his heart had never carried the weight of surrender. With time, Gehazi began to pray in the solitude of his condition. His prayers were not the confident pleas he once heard Elisha utter, but fragile, trembling whispers, born of regret and longing. He prayed for forgiveness, for mercy over his children, for the ability to learn what he had ignored while the light of God was within arm's reach. In his brokenness, something awakened within him, a recognition that the presence of God had not left the world, even if Gehazi himself was now unable to stand in its fullness. His exile became a classroom that no miracle could have provided. He learned that holiness is not an environment, but a posture, that a calling is not sustained by giftedness but by character, and that no amount of spiritual activity can compensate for a heart that remains unyielded. Gehazi realized that he had been so focused on what he could gain from serving God that he had forgotten what it meant to belong to God. And as that truth sank deeply into him, he began to regain what he had never truly possessed before, a reverent spirit. Those who passed by him from time to time noticed something unexpected. Though his body bore the marks of judgment, his voice had changed. There was a softness in his tone, a humility that had never been present when he stood proudly beside the prophet. Gehazi no longer spoke with bitterness or entitlement. He spoke with the weight of someone who had seen both the wonders of God and the severity of straying from him. His story, even in exile, became a quiet sermon, one that required no audience to be true. As the years passed, Gehazi's name grew into a proverb among the people. Parents would tell their children, "Guard your heart so you do not become like Gehazi." But they also taught that God remains near to the contrite, even when he disciplines. Gehazi's example became a balance of both warning and invitation. His life showed the cost of compromise, but also the possibility of awakening even after great loss. And though he never returned to his former place of honor, he gained something he had not valued before, wisdom shaped by humility. The highest tragedy of Gehazi's life was not the leprosy or the exile. It was that he had been positioned to receive a legacy greater than wealth or status. He could have inherited the mantle that once passed from Elijah to Elisha. He could have become a vessel through whom God would speak to kings and comfort the broken. He could have become a guide to the next generation of prophets. Instead, he became an example of how potential can be squandered when the heart bows to lesser gods. And yet, even in this tragedy, there was a lingering grace. Gehazi's story preserved in Israel's memory became a lantern for others, a reminder to choose purity over gain, obedience over opportunity, truth over convenience. His failure was not wasted. It became a path marker for those who desired to walk closely with God. Through the silence of his exile, Gehazi's life continued to speak. Do not let what is in your hand become more valuable than what God has placed in your heart. In the end, Gehazi's life stands as both a warning and a call. A warning against the slow drift of the heart that no one else sees. A call toward the kind of surrender that allows God's presence to truly transform. For while Gehazi's destiny was altered, the message of his journey remains clear for every generation. Proximity to God's work means little if the heart remains unchanged, and purity is a treasure that no amount of silver can buy.